This video, we will turn to the Indus River Valley along the Indus River in what is modern day Pakistan. Um, just so you know, the Indus River does go through Pakistan. It's not part of India now, and we get our earliest civilization here in this region. Now, we're coming back from the old world, and we talked about some of the other civilizations like Mesopotamia, etc., in the old world. And so we're coming back to that, talking about India and China and some others. Um, and here is the Indus River Valley that was discovered in the 19th century along the Indus River. I will show you this to show you its general location. I want you to pay attention to the two sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Harappa on the upper right, Mohenjo-daro closer to down to the left, and Baluchistan. Um, these are the two major sites. Harappa, where it was first discovered, it gave its name to the culture. We don't know what they called themselves, and for this very early period, and that's what it's called now. Those are, as I said, the two major sites. Once again, it is located along the Indus River. I point this out because what's interesting is that we've talked about, for example, with the Mesopotamian cultures along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Egyptian culture along the Nile, and there was an earlier sort of anthropological, archaeological theory that these great sort of civilizations, these complex societies with written language and urbanization and social stratification, etc., would emerge because of riverine environments, and that's partially true. We see it in Mesopotamia, we see it in now, and indeed we'll see it in China. But it's not always true, and especially not true in the New World. So that idea has been abandoned. Not that it's a terrible idea. It's certainly sometimes occurred. It's just that we can't apply it to all rise of complex civilizations. Some do it without these major rivers, but it's certainly a pattern we see in the old world. Now, an important thing to keep in mind about the Indus River Valley, which is located on this map between where it says Persia and Hindustani. These are much later names. I show you this because they show the spread of what we call Indo-European languages. Ultimately, the European language group comes from the Indian River Valley and spreads out into the north and then eventually into the west, into Europe. So we speak a descendant of the Indus language, which I'll talk about at greater length in a moment. And I want to show you this slide here. The Indus River Valley is civilization, I should say. It's about around somewhere around 3,000 to 1900 BC. The mature phase here is 2600 to 1900 BC, but it gives you an idea of the range of the culture. And this is all based on artifactual style. As we'll see, a language yet deciphered, but nevertheless a language. And once again, the two major sites you should pay attention to are Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. And here we get some early forms of writing, or the earliest form of writing in this area. It is undeciphered. So if any of you want to try to figure this out, you could make a big name in history if you could. There have been attempts at it, but nothing is accepted by the scholarly world. And the first attempts were made in the 19th century because this culture was discovered when India was a colony of the Brits. And when I say discovered, it really doesn't mean discovered. It just means brought to the attention of European scholars. In any case, there are many symbols. There's like 200 of them, so it's hard to know. There's a lot to work with, and it has yet to be deciphered, primarily because there's no bilingual or trilingual. The equivalent of a Rosetta Stone. There's no nothing written in this script that's then right beside it in a script that we do know. I do want to point out the swastika is one of the symbols here. I've talked about that in the past, and I'll talk about it in this context and how that ended up getting bastardized by the Nazis. Here is just some, there's a close up of this script, and we see here on the bottom a nice boat, but more importantly is this script above. And on the bottom, that's not a replica of what we see on the top here, but just some more of the symbols. And it can't be read. There have been attempts, but we don't know. And this predates what's called Sanskrit. This is the Rig Veda, which is a sort of an epic poem written in Sanskrit, which is which will be the next language that occurs. This is pre-Sanskrit, what the Indus Indus script. So it is not this, and this is known. And Sanskrit is basically the origin of the Indo-European language group. So the origins of our language actually go back to the Indus River Valley, Indian subcontinent, and it would spread out from there and take on various forms that would become the Indo-European language groups that are all over Europe and major parts of Asia, as shown in that last map. Interestingly enough, we get this, as I said, this predates the Vedic, and we get two interesting stories post Harappa, which are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which are broadly similar to the Odyssey and the Iliad, and they seem to have a general shared general ideas. So this is prior to that, and so prior to these Indo-European languages, and prior to the spread out of the Indus River Valley of a later language that would come with a subsequent culture, but we're not there yet. Here's a seal. This one was found in Iran, interestingly enough, which shows the exchange networks. This is from a cylinder seal. It's been rolled out. You can see some of the script on top there, and on the bottom you can see some of the sealing or impression left by the seal as it's been rolled out. And we see some cattle at the bottom there. So we get a lot of evidence like this. There are, as I said, there's like 200 symbols in the Indus script, but they're usually found in just groups of like 5 or 10. There's no sort of long text, which would help in deciphering it. And here are just here's another a seal and the impression that it would leave. They've been trying to connect the later Brahma script with the Indus script. This has not been entirely successful, and so but people were doing what they can to try to figure it out, but it's still a bit of an enigma. But they do have an extensive writing system, so they are recording information for one thing or another. Now, once again, let's go back to our map here. Once again, these things like Persian and Hindustani, etc., Russian are later, but they develop out of these languages that do evolve along this Persian Hindi line there. And as I said, go to the north and then eventually spread out to the west. As we can see, they go down into Greece, for example. And I point that out because, as I said, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are broadly similar to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And one of the things they share in common are the use of chariots and in warfare. And so that shows a connection and sort of a conquering aspect to it. Moreover, these languages, spread from the Indus River Valley over all of Europe and much of Asia, etc. So they are, how did they spread? And a lot of people thought it's because of conquest. And then we know from these later Vedic, you know, epics of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata that, like in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's full of warfare and conquest and invasions. So perhaps it did spread that way. But this gives us a good idea of our language groups here. It's interesting to keep in mind, by the way, that, like, for example, Farsi, the modern Persian language, is much closer related to English than it is to Arabic. It's Arabic and Hebrew are Semitic languages that are of completely different organization and type. The Indus language, well, the subsequent Indus languages would match those of the of the European script. But this one prior to the to this later language is still undeciphered. But to go back to this, one that is deciphered, for example, we'll see the Ashoka pillar, which shows a script that is known, the Brahmi script, but we're not there yet. I do want to that language would come with this area in purple. Forget about the key where it says around 900. Just showing you this to show you that in that green border, that's where the Indus River Valley civilization is. And you can see here they have the dates coming down to about 1500. In any case, the later Vedic cultures that have ancestral languages to ours were not there yet, but they would replace them. Interestingly enough, with that later language, with the Brahmic script would spread out of India, and we can see here to much of Asia. They would give them the sort of origins of their script as well. And with the Vedic, we start to see the spread of the development of the Indo-European languages, which includes English eventually. And we can see here how they break up into branches. This whole idea of Proto-Indo-European languages emerged in the 19th century with the British colonization of India, and they started to study these things in depth, and they were able to, early on, decipher Sanskrit and read the text, and realize that the Sanskrit texts in many ways were predecessors to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and other early texts in Europe and the Middle East. And so we can see where they all come from. And here it's very interesting. They use words like, for example, mother, which seems similar to so many of the different languages, and father, and words like bread, and water, things that would be commonly used, and words that certainly existed back then, right? You don't say, don't try to compare words for, I don't know, cars or something. So we can see that there's a lot of similarities there. And because of the Indo-Europeans, this whole sort of language organization emerged as a scholarly pursuit. And look, if we look at this, we can just see the many, many branches that come off the Indo-European or the Proto-Indo-European language group. In any case, getting back to this is once again later. The This comes with the Vedic culture, which will emerge in the second millennium BC, but we're not there yet. This Indus culture is not deciphered quite yet, but it has been discovered. It was discovered in the 19th century by the Brits, and they have a very complex, large urban settings like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. And here's just a plan of one, which has these main streets here, these large streets, organized, broadly on a grid, not completely, but somewhat organized and broken up into blocks, and then within those blocks into apartments of and houses of various size, etc. So it's a very, very, very complex social organization. Basically, it's urbanization. And so this is happening, around the same time that it's happening in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Now, one of the interesting things is that it's these Harappa and especially Mohenjo-daro are these great baths, and this is quite interesting because baths will become very important later on in the religions of India, and indeed it's part of Christian concept of baptism, etc. But we see these baths emerging prior to the Vedic script, which we can read. So we think there might be a broad religious connection here. But we can also see just the extensive use of mud brick throughout these sites of these large, large sites. Mud brick and normal brick, I should say. And here is just a reconstruction of the bath here, which shows the drainage system and all the rooms that would have been around it for various reasons, I guess, changing or what have you. But it does show this interest in public bathing. We know from later religions it has a religious purpose to it, as it does in many in other faiths as well. But it also just shows that there's they had a complex irrigation system that allowed for bathing, and that's quite a step in societies. It shows a central social organization, control of the water sources, large public structures, perhaps an emphasis on public health, and just the complexity that we've seen elsewhere around this time in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And here we see, they call it the larger reservoir here, but in any case, they're able to manage large amounts of water. And here is just on the left is another shot of bottom left, what I showed you before. On the upper left, it just shows you these roadways and how well the bricks are preserved, etc., and how large and complex they are. And on the right, we see this drainage system that now has the pavers, the covering stones gone, because it's right down the middle of the road, and you wouldn't want the water exposed there, especially if it happens to be sewage. So it was covered over. But in any case, it shows that if there's central irrigation as well, people sharing irrigation, sanitary, that is, irrigation, agricultural, sharing these water systems, that there's sort of centralized planning, city planning in these cultures, just like, as I said, in contemporary Middle East and Egypt. And here we just go back to the Great Bath again. On the bottom left is a reconstruction of what it might look like when all the buildings were sort of more complete. On the what's left in the upper left, it's not, they don't develop it too much, but it gives us a general idea. And on the upper right is sort of a reconstruction of what the city would have looked like. So these are major cities. These are not villages. These are not peasant farmers living off subsistence farming, but they're involved in trade and exchange, and what's this? It was social stratification and a written language, and so these things are fully urbanized, complex societies. I just show you this just on the right, there's still work being done where they're surveying some of these sites. I believe this is Mohenjo-Daro, still on the right. On the left, upper left, I want to show you this because it's just a little toy of a wheel and wagon, but it shows that they had the wheel and the wagon. The extent to which it was, used is uncertain, but they had it, and that's important for understanding the complexity of the society and their technological advances. And on the lower left, we have this one statue um, uh, with this man with a beard, large lips, wearing some sort of seal on his head. That is to say, remember a seal for impressing, and it looks like it was strapped to his head. And then another one on his arm. We've seen that before. In Europe, they did the same, or in Mesopotamia, Mediterranean, they did the same thing. Um, and then he wears this cloak, which has this trifoil decoration on it. But and then these very, very closed, broad eyes. So we see the depictions of humans here, and we will see more of those as we go along. There's still, a lot of work being done on this culture. As I said, it started in the 19th century, but there's still a lot more to study. Here is on the left, just an example of how sophisticated the architecture is to the point they could build these large towers. On the bottom right is the upper level of one of the sites. We will see that the Harappan culture dies out, somewhere in the early second millennium BC and is replaced by the Vedic culture, which would produce the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which do talk a lot about warfare and chariot fighting. And these layers at these sites, broadly, these layers of people being killed broadly correspond to when the Vedic people would come into the area. We cannot necessarily say, one caused the other, but it is quite interesting. And they do say about themselves later on that they came in and conquered the region. And so we don't know to what extent these cultures were dramatically different from one another, but it does leave the Indus culture, the Harappan culture, I should say, the pre-Vedic culture, less known than later. And I just want to show you here a depiction of a woman as well. And notice just her wonderful decorations here on her arms and her necklace. I'm not sure what that is in her left hand, perhaps a bowl. But she's shown, in the vaguely contraposted position with her arm akimbo and, and her head tilted. And there's a bit of naturalism in the art. It's not, just a straight frontal depiction. But it's, it's one a figurine you can sort of walk around. It also shows that they could handle their metal, their bronze, quite well at the time, and use it for artistic decorations. Now, people might like to make sort of try to make connections between subsequent deities and this figure. I just don't know, and I'm not going to go there. But there is this interest in showing the human body, and it also just shows good development in the artwork. The I just wanted to show you this too. This little toy model of some sort of wagon. This wasn't a transport wagon here. This was a plow. Those animals or beasts of burden, most likely zebus, longhorned cattle, who are pulling a guy who has a plow there. But they have mechanized irrigation. They are using the wheel. It isn't just a toy, and producing agriculture on agricultural produce at a far higher level than simply subsistence of farming. So as we see in Mesopotamia and Egypt at the time, it goes beyond just simple subsistence farming to more. I don't want to say cash cropping. That's too might be too much of a step there, but certainly you'll have surplus used for exchange of other goods. And so, as we've discussed earlier, they could specialize in one crop and then and exchange that for other ones. In any case, this tells us something about their agricultural practices and shows us their technological sophistications. I just want to point out here that there are some connections between the Indus River Valley and the contemporary Mesopotamian society. For example, there's this wonderful seal impression, and it's written in Akkadian. And Akkadian is an early language in Mesopotamia, dating from the 3rd millennium BC, coming right after Sumerian, and so it can be read, and we know it's a foreign language. But look at these long-horned cattle here, and those are zebus, which are local cattle here. And then there's some deity on the left and the right holding water holding vessels which water comes out of. And this is a very common motif, once again, in Mesopotamia. So there seems to be some connections here. Notice that they are shown in profile, though their faces turned towards us, giving water to these animals. And then they are on top of what seems to be an aerial view of a river and its banks. Notice the symmetry of the piece. And once again, this would be from a cylinder seal that would roll. And so it would repeat itself over and over. But we get this nice artistic design early on, and showing us not only these cattle early on, but showing us that they were using, not using, but had interactions with societies to the west of them, these other complex urban societies, and which is quite fascinating. Now, once again, they will get replaced by this Vedic culture. Forget about the key on the bottom where it says area of early Hinduism, etc. I'm not referring to that quite yet, but I do want to show you that the green line is what's really important here, and that this exists. This one has it from about 2500 to 1500 BC. So we can see that the dates are a little bit fuzzy, but broadly the 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC, and around the Indus River Valley. Once again, like we saw in Mesopotamia and India and Egypt, and we will also see in China. And after this, the next lecture will pick up with the invasions of Vedic society and the establishment of the Indo-European languages, etc.